Sattler 5.
And I think it's gonna be a long, long time till touchdown brings me around to find I'm not the man they think I am at home. Oh no, 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 I'm a rockin' man. Rockin' man, burning out his fuse up.
Welcome back to the Sattler Files, and our rocket man from Stratosfear, Jamie Holroyd, joins me. How are you, Jamie?
I'm fantastic, Tom.
We're going to talk about, well, the thing that makes the world go round today, aren't we? Money.
Money. Oh, it was interesting. I was just seeing and listening to your previous segment, and I was very inspired or disgusted. I'm not sure which one. Murray Korf, his first issue with the people locked up in Lebanon was that Channel 9 was going to have to continue to pay their wages. So
yeah,
clearly he had a finance bent to his thinking. So.
Yeah, well, I guess, I mean, as he mentioned about the ratings thing, it is about money. Commercial organisations, that's their lifeline. If they haven't got money, they can't operate.
No, exactly right. And I think in a changing world, that the certainty around the amount of money available and to invest in with significant changes all the time becomes harder to predict. So
now we've noticed there's been a shift, and I know from organisations I've dealt with and such that you've got good payers and you've got bad payers, and you've got ones that maybe vary their terms but don't tell you about it, and then you've got organisations like Rio that come out and do tell you about it. And they've made a very big announcement, really, in terms of the ramifications for all their suppliers, haven't they, about their trading terms? Yeah,
for all the listeners out there who weren't familiar with this story, that Rio Tinto came out and just announced that they were going to pay all their suppliers on 90-day terms. And as someone said to me, that if you've got the Prime Minister commenting on your payment terms, maybe you've got a problem. So.
The purpose for them doing it, first of all, simply a cash flow issue?
Oh, yeah, typically. I mean, that's a huge business, right? And if you can slow down the rate at which you pay people, so what you've got to think of is for a period of time, you're probably getting away with, if you're paying someone on 30-day terms and you're going to take it to 60 or 90, you're basically missing out on two payments. And for a company of that size, that could be worth millions of dollars, and in some cases, very large business could have been worth billions of dollars. So that's why they do it. The challenge is that most people who deal with those large firms tend to be much smaller companies, and they don't have the capacity to deal with it. So it can create huge problems, and hence why the Prime Minister was straight onto it. And Rio Tinto sort of had a public shaming back into their box and changed it to 45 days terms, I believe. So.
But even 45, that's at the higher end of terms for a lot of organisations. And if you're a supplier and it's you land it's great that you land a multi-million-dollar deal, but if you're not going to get paid for it for ages, it's a bit bittersweet, isn't it?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of issues to consider about this too. So let's say I'm a widget maker and I land my first big contract with Rio Tinto, and they order, they say, we're going to order $1 million worth of widgets every month, and we're going to pay you with our normal terms are 7 days or 30 days, and they say we're going to pay you on 90 days. Now, what tends to happen is everyone in the company sort of says, well, this is a good deal, and they go with it, right? What you need to do is sit down and say, all right, if we're going to be paid on 90-day terms, we're going to do work for 1 month, say $1 million. Then we're going to do another work for another second month, there's another $1 million. A third month, till we get up to 90 days, we've got $3 million worth of exposure. Then we're going to send the invoices out, and then there might be a slight delay in them getting paid. So we're typically going to have 4 months worth of exposure and $4 million exposure for a $1 million a month job, right? Now, if that all goes pear-shaped, you're going to be in a world of trouble. Plus, you're going to need the working capital along the way to sort it out. So often what people see as a minor detail or something they don't stop and think about, it has huge ramifications. A lot of businesses over the last couple of years is what they call invoice finance has been very popular. So
factoring, as it was called years ago.
Yeah, which always had a dirty connotation to it. So people use factoring when they couldn't get money in any other way. Right? So it was seen as a lending of last resort. It's sort of been rebadged and more fashionable over the last 10 or 15 years. So basically what happens is I've got an invoice. I've got my invoice for $1 million. And I take the invoice along to my factoring company, it might be a bank or a finance company, and they give me 80% of that money on day one, right? So that I use that to fund my business. And that works pretty well, and it works well for companies that don't have a lot of security or businesses are growing fast. But where it's been a problem over the last couple of years, in particular in a WA context, is where businesses have started to shrink. So what happens is the money that I push out the door when I factor my invoice is less than the money coming in that I had to pay for the last one. So so it's great when a business grows, it gives me access to capital, but as it shrinks, I suddenly have to come up with all this money to pay the difference between the two, and it becomes really challenging.
So it's sort of like taking a second mortgage, effectively.
Well, it's like a margin call. Yeah. So I call it a working capital margin call.
Yeah.
And people aren't ready for it, and they don't expect it. We dealt with a company about a year ago, was in a bit of trouble, and the bank sort of looked at us and says, "Well, what's happened?" I said, "Well, it's perfectly obvious what's happened. Is the sales are shrunk, and we've had a working capital margin call. So, and if the business is not ready for it and it's got no other plans." If you think about it too, if you're using invoice finance, you're typically using that because you didn't have many other options.
Yes.
So when that option dries up or becomes hard or you need extra finance, there really is nowhere to go. And this creates a real lot of difficulty. So what happens with most businesses when they start is people go into it typically undercapitalised. Right?
Yep.
So they don't have enough equity to start the business. And what it means is as the business grows, that cash has got to come from somewhere. And often it's internally generated. So maybe we pay our creditors slower, or maybe we get a little bit behind in paying the tax office, or paying our employees entitlements, and that's the sort of cash that starts to fund the businesses.
Yeah, and so where do you go to from that if you're in that situation?
Well, look, you probably need to start to get some help, because once you're there, once you've taken that help, there is no buffer left for you to sort anything else out. So, and what often happens is people are using the tax office. So, tax office is currently Australia's largest lender, all right, which is a position they don't really want to be in. Now, banks have their own policies, and you roughly know what they are, and you can work with it. The tax office is a different beast. If they decide to start reining things in, it can cause a cash call of say $100,000 or $200,000. It's not unknown for the tax office to start winding people up if they get behind in their debts, and often people don't see it coming. So for a lot of business owners too, they're not on top of the numbers and they're not on top of the process, and often these things come as a complete surprise.
So to obtain finance at the moment, I mean, you're saying that the whole factoring or invoice finance, as you call it, is still seen as a bit of a last resort? Oh,
look, I think it don't get me wrong, it's the right purpose for the right solution, right? So it certainly has a place, but you just need to understand the shortcomings of it. But what's happened over the last couple of years is a number of the banks have pulled out of that market. So it's probably been left more to second-tier lenders to fill that space, which they fill pretty well. And the reason the banks have pulled out of it is it's quite expensive to administer. So you've got to put up all your invoices all the day. Someone has to check them, reconcile them, do all that sort of thing. You need someone to come out and audit what's going on in the company to make sure nothing's going wrong.
Well, because there's been lots of stories of that, hasn't there, about factoring fraud over the years with people, creating false invoices to create additional cash and that sort of thing. That's actually where it got a lot of its reputation from, wasn't it?
Well, I think the temptation becomes too large, right? I'm in a world of pain. I've got the tax office at my door. I've got to pay the wages next week. What do? I can raise an invoice and factor it. And unfortunately for some people, that temptation is just too large. And that's not widespread, but it is what can happen. And that's why the finance companies have these audits that they do. So
the cost of that sort of finance, if the banks have bailed out of it and it's second-tier lenders, I'm assuming that the cost of that finance is also considerably higher than it would be otherwise or through another means.
Yeah, and this is a really interesting discussion point. So it is substantially more expensive than an overdraft or typical term debt. But the way I kind of explain it to people is what you're really doing is you're really getting access to future equity. So you're getting access to equity out of your sales that haven't really been paid yet, right? So you can look at it as expensive debt or you can look at it as cheap equity. And depending on that, I'd probably go for the second one. And we've had clients that we've recommended use it from periods of time. The one thing is a challenge is getting off it can be difficult as well, because not only do you need the money to pay out the exposure, but you also need another basically 90 days worth of working capital to pay out that timing difference, because suddenly you're going to have to wait another 90 days until you get paid. So.
Yeah. Finance at the moment, we hear a lot of talk about what's going on in the financial markets. There's still rumblings about all sorts of royal commissions and investigations and various other things, but and tightening of rules and ASIC being involved in terms of lending criteria and everything else. What's the current status as far as getting finance?
Well, look, this is interesting. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago when we talked about leadership. If you don't control the tone of things, it'll get out of hand, and you can see very, very quickly the public mood against the banks has turned sour in a very short space of time. You've got the opposition talking about a Royal Commission. You've got the government saying we'd probably like to have one too, but that's their idea, so why don't we give more power to ASIC, right? And so the mood will be it'll become more regulated, more stringent, and I would expect that access to working capital finance particularly will be harder and slower than it would have been otherwise. So,
which only makes business conditions even harder.
Yeah, typically, yeah. So, and look, you know, finance always is a special case because it has such a flow-on impact to the rest of the economy.
Yeah.
If you lend too liberally, the economy looks good, but you always end up with a bust later on. If you're too stringent with it, conditions become very tight and people can't do things. So, yeah, it is a special case, and it does need to make sure that it's got an appropriate amount of regulation without strangling it. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've got a lot of experience in this area. Where do you reckon it sits at the moment? Do you reckon it's too stringent or heading that way?
Look, I think that typically I think in the past it's been probably too easy to get money. So just because the bank lends you the money doesn't mean you should have it, right? And that's a really interesting point for people to consider that and a lot of people don't understand what they're getting themselves into. We are very much focused on trying to bring that corporate analysis down to a SME business or a small or medium business, right? So why do I want to borrow money? Because I want to invest in something typically, right? Now, if the return on what you're investing in is lower than the cost of the capital, then you wouldn't do it, right? But, you know, what happens is everyone gets excited and it sounds like a good idea and we don't really know what the return is, but it sounds positive and maybe sales rocket, but maybe we don't make any money out of it. Right?
Well, I was just going to make that point is that quite often, you know, companies will look at the turnover as opposed to profitability at the bottom line and go, well, you know, it's going to increase sales by X amount of dollars, you know, which generates cash flow, but it doesn't necessarily generate profit.
Yeah, and if you look at this in the broader context, you know, we were quite critical and we did a number of presentations on this, you know, 6 and 7 years ago in the middle of the GFC and the government was spending all this money. And, you know, building school halls and pink bats was never going to generate a significant return. So all that was ever going to happen was the cost of borrowing for those that spending was going to put a drag on the economy, and that's why we've been one of the reasons why we're locked in a sort of slow growth environment at the moment. It was predictable, but what happens is everybody agrees with each other and it all sounds good, and away you go, and that's exactly what happens in a business. And
but everyone's got a plasma TV now.
Yeah.
As a result. So, you know, there's an upside somewhere.
Yeah, maybe we need to bring back the TV license or something for the government to generate a return.
That's not a bad idea. In terms of debt, where do people, or where should they sit in terms of how adventurous they get with it, or how conservative? Because you made a really important point there that just because you can get money doesn't mean you should have it.
Yeah, and look, again, it comes back to the return. So you can have the opposite can be true, and we do see a lot of this as well, where a company wants to invest $1 million or $2 million into some technology or some sort of investment. Now, where that's productivity enhancing and where it produces a good return, they should do it. And often we've got to give people a nudge to tell them to get into it. Right? So you kind of have the two schools of thoughts, and like most things, we always say the truth's somewhere in the middle. So, but the bit that's missing, it's typically the analysis around the financial modelling. Right, and it's modelling of that the financial return of what you're investing in, but also being able to accurately or reasonably accurately predict the cash position of the business going forward, particularly over the short term, so over the next 3 months, but then also in a year or two. And if you have the assumptions right, then it's not actually that difficult to do, but not many people do it. So
the use of a third party to obtain finance, because traditionally, I mean, the model's changed, hasn't it? Years ago, you build a relationship and a credibility, if you like, with your bank because you put money through it and everything else, and that'd be the first port of call. But the world's changed, hasn't it?
Yeah, look, there's certainly there's a huge proportion of finance that comes through third parties, particularly brokers, and like most things, there's good and bad brokers out there. The good ones understand what they're doing. They probably have a strong finance background, but the temptation again is brokers get paid by commission, so part of their intrinsic motivation is to load you up with as much debt as possible, right? And again, there's probably not that analysis done around it. But
and possibly from organisations that aren't necessarily the best deal for the end user is part of the problem, isn't it?
Well, that can be a real problem as well. And you can see, and that happens also in that financial planning space as well, where you've got a non-alignment of interests. So, yeah, and there has been attempts by the government, but again, it's difficult, to move to sort of fee-for-service type models. So,
in terms of like a business owner understanding how it all works, because finance is same deal. You set up a business, you go into business for yourself, you're all excited because you're good at or you're interested in whatever it is you do. And there's various aspects of the business that, well, you do because you have to do, and you sort of try and learn about, and you keep an eye on everything else. Finance is one of those ones because there's this wall of secrecy behind it as well, as to what the lending conditions are, what the terms are, what the criteria are, what we'll lend on, how much we'll lend on it, that sort of thing. How does a business owner get to know what the hell they should be doing with this stuff?
Yeah, I kind of relate this to sports. So I have a fairly keen interest. I love watching the AFL, and I love watching tennis. I don't really know much about NFL, right? Now, I can watch the AFL and they put up the stats, and you could almost tell who's winning, right? Because you know which stats are important. You know that there's 3 or 4 key ones, and it's highly unlikely if you win those that you're losing the game. Then I might occasionally put on the TV and the NFL's on stats. I have no idea what is going on, right? I couldn't even begin to start to understand what they mean. And I put myself then in the sort of shoes of a small business owner. I think I know who's winning. I think I know what's going on, but I don't really understand. Right? And what we sort of say to people is don't outsource your thinking, right? Don't outsource your thinking to your accountant or a broker or the bank, where you've got to understand you're making this decision for these reasons. Right now, you can rely on those people to give you information, but don't just be all care and no responsibility and say, well, someone else told me to do it, so I did it. So
that's an interesting point, because accountants these days are moving as well, aren't they? They're shifting the business model, because the whole just going through the motion of coming up with the numbers. Accountants really, there's software packages that pretty much do that now.
Yeah.
So accountants are becoming less and less relevant, I suppose, in their traditional form. So you're finding accounting firms are starting to become more advisory, more involved in other areas such as marketing and such, which they've never traditionally been involved in, but they're moving there because they realise that their model has a time limit.
Yeah, well, a lot of their business model is largely driven around compliance type work, right? And that's changing. It's more automated. So they're looking for other streams as well. But we still find that with a lot of small businesses, the challenge is producing good, accurate numbers. The business owners aren't on top of the numbers. The person inside the organisation is maybe doing the best they can, but they probably have no one really checking or assisting them. They probably lack any sort of peer or mentor type support. So one of the real challenges we have when we get involved is trying to get those numbers right. And I'm lucky that I've got a good team who can, instruct and help in that regard. So. And it's harder than you think. Often there's a lot of different assumptions that might need to be made. There's different interpretations of accounting policies and how things are recorded. So,
well, it's interesting you say that. I had a discussion with someone the other day that, was actually going through that point, that something as fundamental as the supplier and the purchaser had a difference of understanding in fundamental terms, and one talked all the time about their product in terms of margin, and the other talked in terms of markup.
Yeah.
And so they're talking two different languages effectively, but they actually thought they were talking about the same thing. And yet the guy buying the stuff couldn't figure out why he wasn't making enough money.
Yeah. And often, this happens a lot, unfortunately. When we out just with someone the other day and we were talking about what their real margins are. And they said to us, it's 50%, I said, well, that's fantastic, And then we pulled apart the numbers and I said, it's not 50%, it's like 20%. In fact, it's 13%. So they said, well, that can't be right. I said, well, because you're not factoring in all these other costs. You're just taking the raw cost of the product versus what you're selling it for. And there's all these other costs. Now, if you don't get that right, you can turn over as much as you want. You'll never make money.
So to actually break that down a little bit further, because that's an interesting area. Just walk us through that process in very simplistic terms. Really, you've got your revenue, then you've got your gross profit, because you've got your cost of goods sold.
Yeah.
You end up with your gross profit. And then from there, of course, you've got your operating expenses, and that ends up with your net. That's pretty much it in a nutshell, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I'll use a really simple example. And, as I said, for my sins, we had a pizza business at one stage, but it's a great metaphor for everything, right? So all my clients are sick of hearing about pizzas. But, here's the cost of the pizza, here's the price of the pizza. Now, if we did a delivery, have we factored in the cost of that delivery? What does it actually cost? Now, that you think that would be easy, right? You say, well, the driver works how many hours, how many do we deliver, what happens if we deliver a different amount, what happens if a short distance, a long distance. So it actually becomes harder. But the answer is you've got to factor it in somehow, right? And all you can do often is take your best assumption and then try and refine it over time. But it's just to say, there's no cost, we don't need to worry about it, or it's a fixed cost, or is inaccurate. It's not right, because what might happen is if you're not making money at that gross profit level, you start doing more and more deliveries, you start losing more money. So that's what interesting. I noticed Red Rooster started delivering. I was just shaking my head, go, why would you do that?
Yeah, the same. I got one up the road from my place, and I was sort of thinking the same thing, going, really? Why would you do that?
Well, look, I'll tell you what happens, and this is where, it's good for small business owners to be exposed to this. So someone would sit down and say, the delivery market's worth $2 billion a year in Australia, and someone at Red Rooster goes, we need to be a part of it.
We want some of it, yeah.
Now, I'd sit there and say, all right, so how much will our sales go up if we have deliveries? Now, all those people who suddenly get it delivered, were they the people who used to come through the drive-through, right? Now, it's a more expensive cost to serve to have something delivered. So even if we get more revenue, are we actually going to go backwards? Even if we increase our market share, are we actually going to go backwards? Now, they might have done that analysis. Maybe the answer is yes, but I'll watch with interest to see how long they do it for.
Yeah, not kidding. Now, with the political developments this week, with the trigger now for the double dissolution being pulled, with the Senate vote being lost, the likelihood of a July 2 election comes up. The budget is only a couple of weeks away, which will pretty much be you would think, the cornerstone to the election platform for the Liberals. What are you expecting for business in the budget?
Oh, look, Malcolm Turnbull's a shrewd man, right? And I don't think he's been sitting around doing nothing for a long period of time. I'm actually expecting a few rabbits to come out of the hat, to be honest. And I don't think he's put this plan in place without... I mean, it's a tough environment, right? Normally you go to election and you got full of election sweeteners. Well, the last couple of years has meant that they aren't there. There's a bit of pressure to increase taxes, and there's almost a public mood to increase taxes, which is always a challenge, because once you let government spend too much, then they have to go and tax, right? So you really always want to try and have a bent to making the government more efficient and making the economy more efficient rather than raise taxes, right? So that's always got to be the bent. But I can't imagine a government bring down a harsh budget and then go into election a couple of weeks later. So,
no, the timing of it's incredible, isn't it?
Yeah. And what you're going to have too is you're going to have, it used to be, not so much recently, but it used to be certainly as soon as there was election, business activity stopped, right? Because nobody knew what was going to happen. We wanted more, certainty and agreement about what outcomes were going to be. So you're going to have particularly a pause on the economy, maybe right up to the 30th of June, right? That's going to be really interesting. So it's not going to be boring anyway, Tom. That's my assessment of it. So.
No, and I would think with the double dissolution, with the attack that will obviously be launched onto the current crossbenchers, it's going to be a pretty interesting sort of play, because you would think the whole purpose of the double dissolution is to try and, for the government to try and come out of it with a majority and get rid of the spoilers that currently sit there in the Senate.
Yeah, and I think from both the major parties, they'd be both happy to wipe out those smaller independents. I think they haven't realised what's happened, right?
Yeah,
so they've been the ones who wedged themselves. But the one thing that does happen, Tom, in the lead up to election is we talk often about interest rates, we talk about exchange rates, and all these things that affect business and business confidence. One of the biggest things is the aggressiveness and the attitude of the tax office, right? So if it gets more aggressive in terms of reining in outstanding debts, it has a massive impact on the economy. Now, I would expect in the lead up to election, they might be a little bit more generous around that. So,
do you think in that regard that all this talk about large organisations paying their share of tax and the tax office role in that, do you think that'll actually become an election issue?
Oh, no doubt. I don't think there's any downside to making sure large companies pay more tax. But I watch these conversations with a great deal of interest, right? And my view is always very, very different from everybody else's. I suppose because I have a very different vantage point. But I can remember, Tom, for the listeners, years ago, there used to be a bank tax where it was called FID, Financial Institutions
right.
Duty, right?
So there was two, wasn't there? There was a FID and a bad tax.
Yeah.
That's right,
yeah.
yes.
With great names for both of them.
Yes.
But, so one of the arrangements that some clever accountant came up with was in Queensland, because they didn't have any government debt, they had lower government taxes, and therefore they didn't have this duty that everybody else had. So someone creative came up with this idea that you could start an account that's based in Queensland and shuffle things around. And it's interesting because accountants and bankers were going around saying, look, we'll set this structure up for you. It costs you $20,000, $50,000. You'll save all this money. And you would be surprised how many companies said, look, that I'm sure what you're doing is legal. I'm sure it's all, but we don't like it. Right. And so that the attitude that, companies rip people off and they, if it smells dodgy, people don't want to be associated with it. So what is, and I'm not saying that people don't underpay their tax, particularly the big end of town, but particularly if you're running a big, large corporate company, you can't afford a scandal, right? No. And so you probably want to be as clean as you can. Now, if I was running the government, which I'm not, luckily for all the small business people out there, but the one area where nobody pays any tax is in terms of fringe benefits, right? So there'd be millions of tradies out there and small businesses where they have fuel cards and, phones and laptops and all these things that they're not paying any fringe benefits tax on. If you were the government and if you wanted to just enforce the laws that you have, you'd probably balance the budget overnight, to be honest with you. So if I'm a small business owner, you might want to make sure you check your compliance around those sort of things and start bringing it up to speed, because I would expect there'd be more focus around those type of things. So.
Interesting view. Interesting view. And to contact you? They
can contact us via the Stratosfear website or message us on the Stratosfear Facebook page. And that's Stratosfear with F-E-A-R.
That is it. Jamie Holroyd, always good. Speak to you again soon.
All right. Thanks, Tom.
Jamie Holroyd from Stratosfear. You can contact him at Stratosfear, which is F-E-A-R on the end.com.au. And we'll be back very shortly here on the Sattler Files.
This is the Sattler Files.